got into Manchuria, that was about the 11th of November, we went into this old cavalry camp. And it was, all the buildings were about half underground. And I was pretty sick at that time. I had malaria and dysentery, and go to the doctor, and doctor, all he could tell you was well, with that cold, he said, just go back to the barracks and breathe steam. So we had little peachka stove, and we could heat some water on top of the cold stove. But we were in that camp for nearly a year, I imagine.
All through the first winter, and you arrived in November of 19.
And all of the people who worked at MKK would march back and forth. It was a long walk, back and forth every day.
Yeah. But this was that you arrived in November of 1942.
Yeah.
To Mukden Manchuria.
Mukden Manchuria.
And that was the Mitsubishi complex there.
No, this was the Army, Japanese Army barracks.
Right, that's where you were put.
That's where they put us.
But the company that you worked for.
Well, I didn't work for any company because I was ill and sick, and then when I recovered in the spring, well, they took me over to the Jap garages, and I worked in the Jap garages for over a year, about a year. And then when they built the new camp, we all moved into the new camp. But in the meantime, out there, we lost, first winter, we lost 250 men.
Oh my goodness.
And
were they all Americans or mixed?
That was all
Americans. All Americans.
Yeah. And
from the cold and the disease.
Disease, but you see, people don't realize that we were all pretty well sick before we left the Philippines.
Sure.
Because we've been on quarter rations for months, and so consequently, those fellas that it was, well, the ground froze, I would say 2 feet, 3 feet deep. And so that was one of the details that a lot of the guys were on. We're up digging these graves for this springtime thaw. And before the bodies all thawed, they were starting to thaw, we finally buried 250 of them in a mass funeral.
And that was in the spring of 1943?
Well, in the spring of 1943, right.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
And in the meantime, we'd had 3 fellows that had tried to escape and were turned in by the Chinese, and then we were made to stand out and watch them shoot them. And then, in the meantime, they built this new barracks area, 3 big barracks,
just
a
for
mess
the
hall, and and of course Japanese quarters and all that stuff too, but in the hospital.
It was an entirely new, separate complex for the prisoners.
Right, and it was, I would say that it was about a mile, maybe not quite a mile.
From where you worked.
To MKK.
Yes.
Plant. And so, of course, all the people that were supposed to be on this detail that came up to Manchuria were supposed to be machinists and, you know, people that knew something about running lathes and sanders and all that kind of thing. And of course, when we got up there, well, the guys, there was a lot of us that didn't know anything about that. And so I was in learning, teaching me how to run a lathe for 6 months, while all the guys that could run lathes were out digging ditches. And so,
just make sure this, keep going.
So consequently, I was there in MKK, I would say about maybe a year, 9 months, a year. And then they needed somebody over in the overhead crane plant behind us, that they were building these overhead cranes, in fact. And so I went over there and I worked over there about 6 months. And then they needed people out at the textile mill, so they pulled me off of that and sent me to the textile mill. And that's where Leo Padilla, you know,
Yes.
we're talking about. And
Some people describe that as a tent factory, but it was
no, it was
making textile
it was looms, all looms, but making canvas.
canvas. That's why people
Yeah,
said
but
tent. Yeah.
it was what they made mainly was canvas.
Uh-huh.
And I worked in the warp room, which was the warp room was where you hung up all of the thread that ran into the big warps, and they made the warps to go on the looms. I worked in there for, I would say, maybe a year, close to a year. And then I was put into the loom room on a small loom. And on these small looms, after you learned how to operate them, well, you found out that there was a ratchet down there that you could switch up and you could make cheesecloths. So everybody was making cheesecloths, but everybody was guarding any guard that came in. Well, they give the alarm and then you'd turn these things back, and by the time the guard got to you, well, you were making good canvas again, you know.
Oh.
But they caught me one day and whopped me across the head with